Hi and welcome to another, well, certainly in the UK, cold and frosty morning. It's been -23 up in Scotland overnight. So I hope wherever you are, you're either tucked up warm or you're in a warmer climate. But joining us today is two of our friends. It's a very European feel today to this session. So we've got Ira joining us from Holland. We've got Marcos joining us from, I think, Madrid. If he's still located in Madrid and hasn't sort of rushed off to the countryside. And Brit, understanding of the use of psychometrics, whatever that means to you. So we're going to be using some terms. We're going to be using things that may sound a little bit strange. So we're going to do our best to make it as simple and as easy for people to share their views with us and understand what we're talking about. But not because everyone listening is simple, but just because we can sort of get a bit anal about how we describe things, and because this is the world we inhabit, we can sometimes assume that everyone knows what we're talking about. So we're going to try and keep it a bit more general. And if you are listening to this, and I know a few people will be, if you think we are getting a bit up our own whatevers, then please challenge us, throw a question at us, or say, hold on a moment, I don't understand what you're talking about. The other thing to mention is we are using a new bit of technology this morning, which we haven't used before. So as with everything we do at Let's Talk Leadership, we've tried to constantly upgrade, continue to improve, change things in the spirit of sort of the more we do of this, the more comfortable we get with some of the topics we talk about, particularly change and stress, which might come into our conversations this morning. So where are we going to kick off? Ian, you were mentioning just before we started this whole issue about sort of predictability and people being boxed in. So perhaps let's start there and see where we get to.
Okay, all right.
Any time we mention a psychometric, I think we ought to put a sort of a little bit of a three-liner in to say exactly what it is, perhaps. Okay.
So I guess the first thing we should do is do our best to describe what do we mean by psychometric. So if I use my very simple definition, it would be it's a tool, if you like, and that can sound painful at times, but it's a way of looking at yourself or looking at other people by filling in some questionnaires maybe that are research-based, validated, and they tend to give you some profile results which would indicate certain things. They could be preferences, they could be personality traits, and but in the work that we do, many of us on our programs of work, we often use them as a way of giving people a greater self-awareness, and I think that's the beauty of these things. So it's using data to be more aware of yourself, your preferences, your behaviours. But the thing that I'm curious about, Matthew, and the team here today is, can it help us predict behaviour? Can it help us predict how we may react or respond to a certain situation, like the lockdown, the pandemics, and the world that we live in today? But can it also help us maybe predict or maybe show more compassion and empathy with others who may be struggling, again, because of the preferences and traits that they would normally demonstrate? So this data, I mean, some of our colleagues may challenge some of these things more than some of us do, but I always find them very useful to have some data. And as an engineer, I like to have some sort of data behind the scenes to refer back to. So that's what I would say. But yeah, is it useful to predict behavior would be my little question for us today.
Okay, so let me fire off a couple of thoughts. I like using something called Workplace Big Five, okay? And we all use it, I know. I use it a lot. And one of the things that particular assessment can provide is an indication of the amount of energy that people need to do something. So in that sense, it can predict where people's focus might be best sort of directed, particularly when you're recruiting people or moving people from one job to another. So as an example, in the Workplace Big Five assessment, it does talk about, your tank being half full or your tank being half empty, and how quickly it drains. So are you doing something that keeps you energized, or are you doing something that actually you're good at, but it drains you quite quickly? So it's not a predictor of how good you are at something, but it can predict where you might be most energized, and therefore the logic is, if you're most energized doing that, that's maybe something you should you should focus on doing. Whereas if you take one of the other ones that I like using, although it is many ways simpler, which is the change style indicator, where you're looking at the preference to change. It doesn't tell you whether you're any good at it or not. It doesn't predict that. It does give you an indication of how you might react personally to a change and what that might look like. And so therefore, I think there is this division between it's predicting possibilities, but not certainties. I think that would be my sort of chuck my pennyworth into the pond for the moment, that all of these things are sort of possible, but not certain.
And it doesn't mean it's going to happen, right? But there could be a risk of a particular reaction of you or other people, because these things help us in context, don't they, of other people. It's not just our own awareness of our own results, our own data, but it's in context with other people, and it's relative to other people, particularly things like the change style indicator, which is a beautifully simple way of measuring change preference. But it explains so much, doesn't it, Matthew, in terms of the context of when you're involved with change, having worked with people who are on the extremes of a continuum of potential behaviors in certain situations. Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I did my Myers-Briggs type indicator training not actually too long ago, probably about 12 years ago. And for about 20 years, I'd resisted doing it completely. Absolutely. I hated it, to be honest, because I'd been to a Myers-Briggs conference in London before I'd become certified. And I'd done my assessment, and I was sitting at, I remember, at a big round table. It was somewhere sort of north London, sort of Islington, just on the edges of the city. And I was at a big table, and we were asked to share our profile. And when it got to me, I shared my profile. So I'm an ISFP. Not that that will mean anything to a lot of people listening. And someone immediately said, "Good grief, why on earth have you come to this conference?" And I said, "Well, because I've come to find out a bit more about Myers-Briggs." And this woman, who I'm sure was trying to be terribly kind and pleasant, said, "But ISFPs wouldn't attend a conference like this." And I was left completely awestruck by not only that someone could, understand me totally from 4 letters and having never met me before, but should put me into a box that I thought, this is too simplistic. And I tell you what, that did put me off for a long, long time.
Yeah.
I think that's the risk with some of those assessments, and people are reluctant to take them because they don't want to be boxed in. And let's be frank, there are no particular boxes that you can put people in. And so it's always a tool, and it should never be more than a tool, as Ian said. I like to describe them, whichever one we use, as a sort of a conversation starter, because when people see their profile, and very often they will have filled it in themselves, so they can argue with it, but they have filled it in themselves. And so the starting point, that is, for me very often, is if people say to me, "But that's not me, that's absolutely not me, that's not true, that doesn't fit," then you can have a very good conversation about, okay, so if that's not you, who do you think you would be more like? And what's the other preference that you're more drawn towards? If you don't see yourself as an introvert, where do you get your energy? How do you recharge? So it's a way of opening up self-awareness and awareness of other people. And that can sometimes be the strongest one, where people say, "Oh my goodness, now I understand why this or that person in my environment reacts like that every time I try to delegate something or whatever." In that sense, it can be very helpful.
Yeah, so I think probably what we're saying then is that psychometrics, assessments, profile tools are really the means to a deep and meaningful conversation, rather than I've discovered that I'm this, therefore I shall go off and be this, or try to be this, or I had no idea I was like this, and it's come as such a revelation. I'm a changed person instantly, and I will, wander off into the distance doing great things. I don't know, Marcus, Ira, any thoughts?
I think I agree with everything that you have said, and that brings the awareness to me of how careful I am in presenting these tools and the way I use the language. If I say to the audience, "This is who you are," I'm actually conditioning the audience to believe that that's the box they belong into. So I am very aware when I present these tools that I say, this seems to be your preference, or this seems to be your choice in response to the situation. So I always try to bring the power back to the person to say, this seems to be your automatic reaction or your most familiar reaction to this kind of situations and circumstances, trying to convey to the person that they have the power to choose differently. Now, in some of these psychometrics, the span of power, it's limited because we go into traits and then we say, well, you've got a very, very slim space. But in other instruments, scientifically, there seems to be that there's a lot of space for you to make other choices, but it's always a choice. And I try to convey that message to try to get them out of the box in themselves, because sometimes if I induce with my language that, they start using that as an excuse not to grow. And they would say, well, you know what, I'm an introvert, so that's it. Nature made me this way, so don't expect me to go and spend the evening with folks and socialize because I'm an introvert, and I've heard from the expert that I need to go up to my room and recharge batteries. So the use of my language is something that I bring into my awareness. Let me share that the way I do that is to try to convey two messages. Whatever the instrument, you've got the responsibility to monitor yourself. And the second thing I convey is, and you've got the responsibility to modify your behavior to be effective in response to the situation. So I always try to emphasize those two things. You still have got the space to monitor yourself and to modify your behavior, whatever the results are. So I just want to highlight the awareness, reminding myself of my responsibility in conveying the message. And those are the two things that I like to share that I always try to convey.
I think it's a great point, Marcus. And just building on what you say, I think one of the messages I would start with would be buyer beware, because a lot of people, as you say, Marcus, will take it as given. So here are my colors, here are my preferences, and it's calculated mysteriously, so it must be true. And you're telling me this is the case, and so that's the first thing, especially for those of us who are less familiar with these kind of instruments. I would use it as a guide and say it's an indication, it's a direction. So partly it's a predictor, as we're saying, and I think in addition it's there to help us understand ourselves a little bit more and to understand others, but very much with a degree of caution, I would say. So it's kind of directional rather than definitive, and it's not predetermined. And it's amazingly powerful. So Ian, to your point about the change style indicator, when we worked with a client back in December 2019, when we could actually meet people face to face, which was a pleasure, people quickly, when we used the change style indicator, people clearly and categorically decided which of the three preferences were best fit. And not only did they sort of identify with their own group, so if you're an originator, you say, I'm great at creating new ideas, they would then look at the opposite group and say, well, that's why you're resistant to change. So quickly, we identify with our own group, and then we sort of, start to challenge, let's say, the out group. And I think as facilitators in the situations, we're very much there to moderate that. And I think there's also another key point, which is to be successful in life and to be successful in work. It's not about developing the opposite or, sort of just sticking with your own preference. It's actually, adding to your repertoire. So if you're more of an originator, coming up with new ideas, it's then how do you also value tradition? Or if you're more introverted, to your point, Marcus, how do you develop then the preference, which might take more conscious energy, more conscious effort to be more extrovert? So these are great tools to help us understand and really expand our areas of self-awareness. So that's how I tend to use these tools.
If I may add, I think it was Ian who suggested the word compassion. And that compassion is one of my things that I've been studying for years and years. Bringing back the awareness on the way I speak to the people with whom I work, I'm also very aware that if I let them to believe that this is the right way of responding to a situation, I may be triggering in the audience the self-rumination process. And that's not very compassionate. Because then themselves they start judging themselves to be ill-equipped to be in that particular situation because they just happen to be introverted. And therefore, I am prompting that self-judgment if I'm not paying attention to the way I speak to them. So it's just, the compassionate thing is a very tricky thing because compassion is defined in a way that it seems to be like rosy-cozy, I'm just going to be nice to you. It's got nothing to do with all of that. I just need to be aware in what way I'm triggering the self-judgment in other people by the way I frame these instruments. Because I have seen people in the coaching session saying, I don't think I'm equipped. I think I should resign because, you know, the circumstances and all. And they just start going into this harsh self-talk because they think they're ill-equipped. So when I step back and said, well, where is this coming from? I'm not going to run the assumption that this happened to you when you were small. Maybe I prompted this self-judgment by the way I delivered the information to you. So, you know, it's a very fascinating topic, Ooijen, when I take on the responsibility of, am I being compassionate here or am I just being unattentive by the way I'm conveying the information, which is triggering the self-judgment in the person, which is completely unnecessary.
I think it's also important to add, which we all always do when we work with clients, that there is no particular good or bad type or profile or preference. Sometimes people have asked me like, okay, so tell me what I should be like then, when they come up with a particular preference. And the answer is always, well, you're yourself. It's absolutely fine. It's about, as Ira said, it's about the awareness and being able to maybe tweak a little bit, adjust a little bit, be a bit more situational, and also know when you overdo your own strength, because every preference, every trait has a good side. It's very good to be able to be calm under stress, for example, which is one of the workplace big five elements. But if it gets too much of a good thing, becomes, you know, you become somebody who doesn't care whatever happens around him or her. So there's always good and bad stuff, and it's a balance, and that's how you have to take it, I think, when you look at these profiles.
The thing that I have to admit I find as a facilitator or someone having a discussion, like Marcos has said, with people where maybe there's one of these assessments that is part of the conversation, is that moment when not only do they understand possibly a little bit more about how they are seen by others, but then they get into that conversation that you raised, Brit, earlier about, well, hold on, that might explain why I get that reaction from someone else when I am in this sort of situation. And so I've noticed whether it's with any of these assessments, I have to admit, I tend to use FIRO-B or Workplace Big Five and rather more than perhaps others, and a little bit of Ooijen. But it's interesting to get into that conversation about seeing people realize, I mean, certainly with the FIRO-B, the Fundamental Interpersonal Relationships Orientation Assessment, and with Workplace Big Five, there are some lovely activities that one can do about, well, if you think you're like this and you think someone else is like that, now put yourself in a situation where you're working with that person, you put yourself back into the reality of day-to-day life. Does it help you at all to understand why on occasions things seem to work really well together and on other occasions things seem to be a little bit more difficult? And I'm surprised it's perhaps longer, but I'm always interested how people start to see beyond the assessment, beyond all the sort of figures and data, and can get into that really deep conversation about, actually, that does explain quite a bit, or it helps me rather to understand a bit more about what.
That's the key. That's the key, isn't it, Matthew? It may not be predicting then, although maybe it can, because there's a risk. And as Marcus was saying, it doesn't mean it will, but it could. But it can often explain. one of the things that I love about the work that we do is when we are doing one of those activities and we have a wonderful, talented group of leaders fighting to try and be successful in a task. It's Marcos is a absolute star at running some of these activities, and I've learned so much from watching you. But it's fun, isn't it, as well? But the real joy is in the discovery process. And here we are with a little clipboard, maybe with all their profiles of change style, influence styles, their interpersonal needs, their character traits on workplace big five or whatever. And we're just looking at people behave thinking, well, that's certainly true. Okay, oh, that's interesting. Yep. And they're just being themselves. Isn't it wonderful? And then when you play it back and you show the mirror back to the person so they can actually see why they were frustrated in an activity and they thought it was about everybody else, actually it was more about them and their own preferences, traits and values and beliefs and things like that. And actually it can help with stress and resilience because they now see that actually they haven't got to change everybody else. They just have to adapt themselves and then get a better result and be more effective maybe. But it's a real joy to see that process. And with our little clipboard. So I don't know if you share the same ideas, but it helps explain. I think that's the key there.
Well, I think it might have been when Marcus and I were together, but I remember being in Davos quite a few years ago now, and I think I was probably sort of number 3 in the team. I was sort of watching what was happening, and I think Marcus, and it had been a friend of ours, Jeff Beeson, who was facilitating, but I'm sure Marcus was there. And we ran an activity in a room, I can see it now, that was sort of separated from the main room. And the participants included American admirals, heads of large corporations. I think there was a church leader there. I mean, there was a whole range of people. And we had set up an activity, you'll know it as the corporate maze, that we'd set up this activity. And I remember watching them literally coming to blows. I mean, they were shouting and screaming, almost physically sort of grabbing each other and throwing each other into this activity. And if you'd taken we didn't because it would have been rude, but if you'd taken a film shot of that and then showed it to their colleagues back wherever they'd come from, they'd be well, they might either be horrified or they'd say, absolutely, this is how they are. You know, but the fact that we were then able to sort of share that experience with them, and I think it might have been FIRO, the FIRO assessment. I can't remember now, but we were able to share an assessment where they said, you know, we're never like this, and then we said, well, just reflect back 20 minutes ago when you were screaming blue murder at someone else. How did that, you know, how does that tie into what you're now seeing in this report, which we're helping you with? I think that it's the realization, I think, with all of these things that's crucial. I mean, they found it funny, you know, afterwards. They laughed about it, but seriously funny in that they had done exactly the sorts of things that this assessment was then suggesting they might do in given circumstances. Again, not total predictability, but at least showing the possibility that they could behave like this if they were triggered. But yeah.
And that's the beauty of it, that through these activities and these profiles, you can show people. It's like holding up a mirror in a sort of in a funny way, which also illustrates the importance of a little bit of humor and perspective, also for leaders in business. I remember that I once, with a colleague, did an activity with a group of executive bankers, and the activity, like many activities, was designed to introduce a little bit of uncertainty. And so we were handing out handouts, and very soon the group found out that some information was clashing. And so the top person in that team turned to my colleague and said to her, "You've made a mistake. These forms, they're not the same. You've made a mistake." And she turned around and smiled and said, "And what makes you think that the mistake is on my side?" And at that point, his whole team started laughing and said, "That's because he always does that. He always does that. That's him." And so it just illustrates how you take your personality even into a classroom, even into a workshop. And that's why these activities are useful.
Exactly. And Brit, it reminds me of the story when you and I did some work with one of our Swiss clients as well, where there's an exercise that involves 2 parts. Part 1 is to plan. Part 2 is to implement. So we took people who have a preference for implementation and action orientation. We put them in the planning group, right? And those who were very good planners, we put them in the implementation group. So it's an experience for them to be in their opposite preference in a way. And the experience is very challenging for them. There's a lot of good learning from that. But I think sometimes these diagnostics can be helpful, not only to understand our preferences, but what it's like to be in a zone where we're having to use our opposite preferences. And, you know, it was very, we had to actually talk people off the ceiling. You remember that session? Because people were very animated. The people who were very action orientated wanted to get on with the show, but actually they were there in a planning group. So, so it's quite an intense experience, but it really illustrates in many ways how predictive these tools are. And also, I think really importantly, the learning comes from putting yourself in situations where you learn to practice the opposite to your preference. That's how we become more agile, more adept, more skilled in working with different kinds of people, different situations, different tasks. And as we were saying earlier, not to use your preference as an excuse, say, well, I'm sorry, I can't do that, but actually say, well, here's my preference. My learning is really to go to my opposite preference.
Yes.
We talk, don't we, a lot about diversity in many forms, but I think one of the purest forms of diversity is in personality, preference, and characteristics and traits. Because often leaders, some of the most effective leaders, are so aware of their own traits and preferences, they can compensate by giving a team and a task the missing ingredient because they're able to adjust and work out of preference. Yeah. Although, as Matthew said earlier on, it does exhaust you if you're actively working out a preference or trait for extended periods of time, which is the case for many of us right now, particularly those who are very extrovert and like that face-to-face contact. It can be exhausting for people. And I think that's one of the challenges. But I'm curious now, I'm just thinking about some of our learnings about other people, but what have you learned about yourself through some of these assessments? Is there anything that we're willing to share that's like aha moments for our own personalities that we've learned through any of these instruments that we use? I'm curious.
I'm happy to share any of it, but I'll share one. If we take the fundamental interpersonal relationship orientation assessment, a wonderful Schutz, I think probably the one that if I had to choose just one to take on my desert island with me, that would be the one I would take, even though there's no one there. So my interpersonal relationships, it wouldn't be terribly helpful in that sense. But I'm in the need, the expressed or wanted need for control. My scores are relatively in the middle. I think it's about a 5 and a 4. That won't mean anything probably to people watching, but broadly speaking, it means that most of the time I'm happy in a situation where certain things are described, structured. I understand where I am and what needs to happen, and there are occasions when I'd like to take control, but not massively so. I'm not going to be sort of leaping to take control all the time. Although interesting, I have just started this conversation, so perhaps that's me taking control. It's a bit of self-reflection on the
it's all relative, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm doing a piece of work at the moment, and I've come to realise that actually I think in the circumstances we're now in, particularly where, as Ian will know and Brit will know, I'm working in an environment that I don't find terribly easy. I think if I looked at the way I've become more controlling, because my need, so my wanted control has gone much higher. I need much more guidance. I need much more structure. And I'm finding it more difficult that when I think I've got that structure in place, someone else comes along and changes it or makes a suggestion. It's particularly true just at the moment. I'm working with 2 or 3 people I've not worked with before, all of whom have got probably great ideas. Well, they are good ideas. But I'm finding I'm getting more and more sort of, I don't want to do that. Actually, this is my little show and I would like to do this, or I would like to do that, or I spent last week designing that, so why are we talking about it again? You know, I've noticed and I think that's me changing because I'm now in a circumstance that I'm less comfortable with, I think.
And it's nice to reflect, isn't it, Matthew? Because you're reflecting on what is it about my preference or style that's causing me this stress in this particular situation, as opposed to why they're doing that to me. It's
Yeah.
What about anybody else? Anybody else got anything that that they've learned? Because I've learned loads about my interesting behaviours. Let's just call them those for a minute. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, following on what Matthew was saying, and I'm going to refer to the same tool, the FIRO-B. The big aha moment for me was it was twofold. First, when I was in the corporate world, I was known to be a leader who will give too much space to other people. So my score in control express is a 1. So I just, have a conversation around what to do and just go ahead and do it. And that created so much trouble in my career because I never thought people needed structure and they needed some guidelines. So for me, when people came back to my office without the delivering, I would just go ballistic and say, well, are you an idiot or what? No, I just needed structure. So for me, structure was kind of a weakness. It's like, well, why aren't you like me? I mean, I don't need the structure, so why do you need structure? So my big aha moment is that for me to be effective, I needed to take into account the needs of other people for me to be effective. So for me, that explained all the trouble I had in leading other people because I would give a lot of space. And my wanted, you're going to laugh about this, my wanted control is 0. So some of you with whom you have worked with me is you come up with idea and my probably immediate predictable reaction is no, bugger off. So, and some people would say, well, that was kind of rude. I said, well, but then the big aha moment is, good Lord, I mean, I need to flex because people need to tell me what they think and I need to take that into consideration. So that was the big aha moment in the application of FIRO-B. And the second one was related to affection. And affection is all about openness and recognition and support and all the rest of it. For me, the wanted affection scores and what, all the aggregate data continues to indicate that that's the highest wanted need in people. So for me, that was, wow. I mean, this is all about connection and this is all about supporting other people. And yes, we talk about assessment, challenge, and support. But for me, 20 years ago, forget about support. Now, for me, that has become a core of my work. In what way am I here to support other people? So affection was another one of those things that for me was a big aha moment. So the lethal combination of 1 in express and 0 in express, it was, now I understand it, for God's sake. Now I understand it. But going back to the compassion, that's when I said, okay, but I still can change it. That was my automatic behavior. I do not need to flagellate myself. All I need is to choose wisely. So that's my two cents there.
And because it's a needs-based assessment you've been describing, you don't have to just lean into your need, do you? You can just put it off for a moment, and the needs of others may be more important in the moment. And I think that's the wonderful thing about that particular assessment. So thank you to Will Schutz and the family that continue his work. It's just an amazingly simple insight into those things. But
that came up very clearly about 3 weeks ago with a workshop where there was a leader on it, very, very effective in terms of what she was delivering, what she was able to achieve with her team, had got hugely positive feedback about her performance and the performance of her team over a number of years. And because most of her team were working from home because of the current situation, she had noticed that the relationship she had with them seemed to have got not just physically distant, but in terms of the relationship, that it seemed to have got a little bit more distant. And she admitted we had done the FIRO-B profile with her, and her express control score was quite high. It wasn't sort of 9, which is the highest, but it was about 7 or 8. And her affection scores were fairly on a low scale. And what she got feedback from was that when she was contacting her colleagues to have online meetings, she was going straight into discussing whatever it was that the team should be achieving.
Yes.
And she had become, and because she was distant from them, by her own admittance, she'd become even more distant from, or she'd become more concerned about, you know, are they achieving stuff? Will we be able to deliver it on time? I need to check in with them to make sure everything's happening. And the feedback she got from her line manager, which I thought was great, was you need to ease up a bit. You know, and he didn't talk in FIRO-B terms, but he was saying, you know, you need to just be aware that the people in your team are now distant from you. Are you spending time socializing at all with them before you get straight into this discussion? And to be fair to her, she literally on screen, like we're talking now, she just said, you know, you're right. You're absolutely right. And we met again a few weeks later, and she'd started just being a little bit, she'd built in some social time. And boy, the difference it had made was huge, both in the way that she was perceived, in the way the team was performing, and in the way her line manager was seeing her. And it wasn't that she was incompetent. She wasn't. She was incredibly competent. It wasn't that she was lacking success. She was very successful. She had all the attributes, you know, charming as ever. But interestingly, that the FIRO, in that case, I would read it as just her control scores had been heightened because of the lack of predictability, if you like, back to your point, Ian, right at the beginning, because she wasn't with them. They were at a distance.
Exactly. And Matthew, I think there's something too from what you're saying about, you know, how we respond when under pressure. And Brit, we talked about this before we started this conversation. So in the current pandemic, you know, which is in fact impacting us, you know, in different ways, but very significantly, you know, we're probably reverting to type a little bit. So personality questionnaires can give us that insight. So if you're very action orientated, like the person you're describing, Matthew, by the sound of things, then you might go more into that kind of mode when under pressure. And sometimes it's helpful to think about what does the opposite tell us that we need to do. And I totally agree with you. That's been my experience too. When we have calls with the teams, you know, that we work with, we say, before we get into the task, tell us how you're getting on. How are you managing? Oh, and you see the change in the facial expression. People are kind of relieved. Oh, I can talk about how I'm managing. This is how I'm coping. I have virtual dinner with my colleagues. We each prepare a particular course. We have dinner together. Can't do it face to face, so we do it, you know, on the screen. So people are quite relieved when they could talk about how they're coping. And I think there's a bit more humanity in the workplace, which I think is really in need, ever more so now than before. So people now find it much more acceptable, thankfully, to have children walking, you know, behind, or sometimes a cat will walk across my screen. You know, that's you know, a year ago, I know of coaches who said, no, if you're a professional as you are, then this is really inappropriate. But actually now, this is a way in which we connect with each other a lot more. So I think that's to be encouraged. But I think, you know, these personality questionnaires that we're referring to really tell us what we're good at, and then there's a risk of doing it too well, especially when we're under pressure. So,
yeah. So you started the question, which I think is fascinating. I'm just curious, what have you learned about yourself from all these instruments?
The boomerang moment's come back to hit me in the face. So I mean, there are many, in the FIRO-B. The FIRO-B we've been talking about is one of my favorites as well. And anybody watching or listening, do some research on that one, because it's incredibly simple and useful, and I've learned loads. But I've also profiled my partner, my wife, and my children. So it taught us a lot about our needs within the family. And that can be quite a challenge when you see that there are some big differences there, but it explains things. But my biggest learning, Brit, was around a different instrument called the Ooijen, which we've touched on today. And it's depending on the version you use, it's very complex. It can have multiple different reports, and there's one in particular which talks about your dark side, and it's where you have some character traits that emerge on a bad day, let's just say. And without giving you the full instruction on what it's all about, you can chunk it up into 3 basic categories, and 2 of the categories were the way that my wife and I resulted when we did the test. I was more of a moving towards type of person under stress or in a challenging situation, and my wife Hazel was more of a moving away from type of person. And what happened is that we were, it made us realize that we always have arguments up and down the stairs in our house. Either I'm upstairs and she's downstairs, or vice versa. And I said, I got it. You're moving away from me and I'm moving towards you under these stress situations. And that's why we're having the arguments up and down the stairs. So in the future, we realize that when we get to that point, Hazel is moving away. I not that I can stop her, but I should allow her to have some time. And of course, my moving towards need, or trait, if you like, a better term, I have to deal with that a bit later on. And we now laugh about it if we're having an argument up and down the stairs, because again, we're just being ourselves. And that's one of my biggest learnings with the Ooijen, that it's okay to recognize these things, and it explains a lot.
Yeah.
We had a question or a comment come up just now, didn't we?
Yeah, we did. Michael has said, first of all, to pick up on Brit's point, a day not laughed is a day not lived in business and private life. You know, a great point. And also the point I've always asked when I interviewed employees, what do I like, what do you like, and what do you don't like doing with this job? And if they're doing things they don't like, it will affect the service we deliver. And that leads to an unhappy customer and is not good for our business. Nobody wins if employees love what they do. It will create great results and happy customers. So true. I mean, going back to the workplace Big Five, because that is not based on a hypothesis. It's based on just, broadly speaking, researching the words in the English language that reflect on behavior. And linking it to previous work that was done called NEO, you do get these situations. I mean, I remember working with a financial services business a few years ago where they had been incredibly successful. I won't mention their name because it's not proper, but they've been incredibly successful in the world of IT. Their data analytics was what had built their business, and they had employed about 300. They'd gone from 2 people, 2 very bright owners of business, to, when I worked with them, about 300 IT people. And they were brilliant at IT, but they started to notice as they grew that they were no good at all the people stuff. It just didn't seem to be working. There was constant comments, not unpleasantness, but just comments about people's development needs, people not listening about work patterns and stuff like that. And by then I'd done about 150 workplace Big Five assessments. And I went back to Paradigm in the States, and I said, who were the company who developed it, back to the Howards, and I said, could you just explain why it is that when we look at where they spend their energy, they all score 0 or outside comfort zone or drained when it comes to anything like recruitment, interviews, coaching, team leaders, team support, team meetings. They, apart from one person in the cohort of about 30 results I looked at, everyone was outside their comfort zone. And the 2 owners of the business and their executive team looked at this and they were quite shocked. And I said, well, that's because you've recruited, I think, for really successful IT people. You haven't recruited people who have team skills, leadership skills. And to be fair to them, they changed their recruitment policy as a result. Not totally, but mainly. And they started bringing in a lot of generalists, people who knew less about the technology, but had experience of working with groups of people. The atmosphere changed significantly. I mean, they were winning awards, not just for their commercial and financial expertise, but for their people leadership, their talent development. And it wasn't because of me, it was because they'd realized, picking up on Michelle's point, that actually they just focused on, perhaps they needed to refocus on something different. And the workplace Big Five assessment had given them just an indication of the possibilities as to why things were happening as they were. But Michelle makes a really, really important point.
Yeah.
So thanks for sharing it. If you're listening in, it's great. So anything else we want to sort of, that comes to mind? I mean, I'm interested in this thing about humour. So, a day not laughed is a day not lived in business and in private. I don't think there's an assessment that says whether we're funny or not, is there? Or
wouldn't that be a great thing to develop, team? Let's have a think about that. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think it'd have to be culturally specific, wouldn't it? I think because humour is different in different countries. So
I worked with a colleague many years ago, named Karen, and she said one day, Ian, don't ask any questions. She's one of my team members. She said, here's a phone number. Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, phone this number. And I said, what? She said, don't ask any questions, just trust me. And crazy guy that I am, I trusted her. So I dialed into this number, and it was a conference call. Back in the days where video conferencing wasn't so popular, so it's going back a few years now. And it was silence on this conference call. And I thought, what's all this about? And then somebody started to laugh. And then somebody else started laughing. And what transpired was it was a laughter conference call. And I ended up aching. My whole body was aching through laughing, only a couple of minutes into the whole process. And then the idea was you just left when you couldn't take it anymore. But there was no jokes. There was no particular humor. It was just somebody laughing. And there was a video on a subway train or a metro train recently that had a similar type of effect where somebody just starts laughing. It's contagious. But the funniest thing was, because I didn't know what the call was about, I was working from home that day. Again, back in the day when working from home was pretty unique. And I was taking the call in my company car on a hands-free set on my driveway. And at one point, my wife Hazel wondered where I was. So she came out, opened the front door, looked out, and just saw me absolutely crying with laughter, and just looked at me and then walked back in again. And then when I finished and came in, she says, what on earth were you up to? And I tried to explain it, but unless you've experienced it, it doesn't make sense. But I mean, laughter, yeah, contagious. And if we can get that humor right and get the balance right, it can be so powerful. But it's dangerous at times as well, because there's a lot of serious stuff going on in the world right now, and always has been. But being able to make light of things that are appropriate, I think, can really get teams to come together and to connect. So another big fan.
So building on that, Ian, what science says is that laughter strengthens the immune system. So, and I come from a country where we love drama, and you've heard me saying that many, many times. We just make things bigger than what they are, and we just insufflate this drama energy into the whole thing that only pulls people down. And what we need is this light energy, so that we can confront the seriousness of the situation with the creativity that we need, with the lightness that we need, with the connection with other humans that we need. And laughter, I think, is a powerful healer, and science demonstrates this. So, and I remember myself saying this to a group of people very recently, and I said, well, yes, there's a virus out there, but the real virus for me is that we're all getting very depressed. And we don't need the depression to resolve the issues that we face. And we need a different kind of energy with which we can resolve the issues that we saw. So laughter for me is a very powerful reminder of the energy that helps people transform. And, we've been in situations where that's just naturally happens in some of our workshops, where people start laughing for no apparent reason. And then we feel that something has changed in the group. There's a bonding, there's a lifting, there's a clearing. Something happened there just through the laughter.
Yeah.
So I just want to thank you for that, Ian, because it just reminds me, how often do I laugh in my life? Am I being sucked into the seriousness of the situation and adding drama to the situation, where the situation requires me to bring the humor to uplift people, so that they can tap to the creativity that we need in order to work together and resolve our issues? So I think it's a very powerful reminder for me as well. So thank you for that.
So maybe our next session, Matthew, is just no talking, just laughing. So sign in next Friday, same time, same place. Just come and laugh. Maybe that's the thing.
I can't do it any longer because, unfortunately, it happened so long ago. But I remember as a child, we spent a lot of time at my grandmother's house in the north of England, and she had a very old wind-up record player. You know, the type. I mean, this is just shows my age, but literally had a handle, and you wound it up, and like a clock spring, then you put an old 78 RPM record, one of those big sort of dinner plate plastic vinyl records on, and it was called The Laughing Policeman. And I don't know who it was. It must have been some comic hall comedian who did it in the 30s. It's very famous. And all it is this man laughing. And it gets more and more ridiculous. And I remember as children, that was our go-to. If we wanted to have literally a laugh, that was our go-to place. Wind up this old record player, put this music, this record on, and just listen to this man laughing. And none of us, it just, I don't care how sad we were feeling or fed up with our grandparents or shouting at each other, we were all absolutely fits of laughter. And as children, you know, belly laughs, rolling around on the floor, absolutely beside ourselves. Why? Because it was just this stupid individual laughing on a piece of plastic, and we were able to sort of access it all the time. It just brings back sort of happy memories. But yeah, maybe we should do that. Okay, maybe
we have the right. So it's let's talk leadership, let's talk laughter. I mean, we have the right acronym and everything, so we should do it.
But picking up on Ira's point that we have to be a bit careful about the culture specific of this, because yeah, for another day perhaps. But I can think of things where the amusement of one is the terror and the rudeness of someone else.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but there are some universal things too, right? I mean, I guess, you know, building up on what Marcus is saying, I think they say that laughter is the shortest distance between two people, right? So it's a really good way of connecting. And, you know, not wanting to darken the tone, but if you look at the book by Viktor Frankl, In Search of Meaning, he talks about his horrific experiences, obviously, in the concentration camps. And even there, in such extreme situations, they found humor. So they talked about the food they were being served. They said, when we get out of this place, you know, we'll have to think about whether we can serve this kind of food at our next dinner party. So, you know, it's very thin gruel and things like that. So even the darkest moments of humanity, there is some possibility somewhere in us to actually find a humorous moment. So I think it's extraordinary, and it takes a certain kind of mindset, a certain sense of confidence in order to do that. So that story certainly stayed with me from that particular book. So given our pandemic situation, of course, it's very difficult for everybody. But somewhere, you know, there might be sort of, you know, opportunities to find a bit of humor to help us get through all of this.
Yeah, as a coping mechanism. Yeah.
Yeah. Does anyone remember the name of the movie that I think it was an Oscar-winning movie, where with this Italian father trying to uplift his child in the middle of this horrific situation in war? What was the name of the movie?
La vita è bella. Life is beautiful.
La vita bella. I think that's a great demonstration of what you know, you can do, and I think you know, as you know, our children might be facing a similar situation where they're wearing a mouth mask and they don't understand what's going on, the severity of the situation, and yet as parents, there is an opportunity to help them understand this in a non-dramatic way, so that they can actually learn how to build their resiliency and learn how to respond to what happens to people, which is just part of life. What I think distinguish a leader from someone else is the way the leader responds to the same situation. So I think for me, I was just blown away by the whole movie, by the resiliency of the father, just playing games in a situation that for me was, at the beginning of the movie, I was so judgmental. I was like, this is irresponsible, this is not true. I mean, but then I got it, and I said, you are a master. I mean, you are not only teaching your child, but the people around you are seeing how you are dealing with the situation in a different way. And, you know, I just wonder what would be the attitude for us to develop more in the present circumstances that we are all facing. So, you know, interesting.
And that links, Marcus, to role modeling, doesn't it? And demonstrating, whether it's psychometric based awareness and self-management of behavior, but it's certainly something to think about in terms of, it could be a new topic for another session around, you know, how do you role model and how do you help people by demonstrating what's possible even in those extreme times.
But it does also bring us right back to the beginning of the conversation where we started, because what Marcus has just expressed is how watching this person behave towards their child showed what is possible, even in difficult circumstances. And so a lot of the sort of assessment work that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation could be summed up like that. It's helping people see what is possible, that things that they might do differently or behave differently or think differently, and what the possibilities are. So really, to where we started, it's not about predictability, it's just about it is possible, even in the most extraordinary times, to have humour. In the most darkest of times, it is possible to behave in different ways, even though you might not want to, but circumstances are saying this is not helpful. So I think we've come full circle in the thoughts, and maybe by Michelle's comment about laughter. And I notice he's put another comment here, looking forward to your next meeting, talking about how important laughter is in life. So right, we've got to do that, team, at some point.
Well,
but we've been running for nearly an hour, so it's probably about time to draw in our reins a bit and say right for another time. If I can just say thanks so much and it was all very last minute. The technology seems to have worked, which is great. And so thank you all for joining us. And if you've been listening, I hope you've found it useful. If you're watching this later, then do still comment about it and get back in touch with us. And next week, we're actually going to be looking at something which is we're going to be helped by one of our coaching colleagues, Jane Miller. So watch this space. There'll be a bit about it on LinkedIn before we get into that next week. So great. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a great weekend.
bye.
Thanks all. Take care.
Bye-bye.